In the winter of 1943, deep in the heart of occupied Poland, there was a woman the Nazis never bothered to look at twice. Her name was never recorded in their meticulous files. Her face never appeared in any photograph the SS bothered to keep. She wore a grey wool dress, thick stockings, and carried a wooden bucket that smelled of lye and bleach. Every morning at 6, she walked through the iron gates of a building that made even hardened soldiers nervous, the regional headquarters of the Schutzstaffel, the SS in Lviv. To the officers in their crisp black uniforms, she was furniture, she was a mop, she was nothing. And that invisibility became the most dangerous weapon the Third Reich never saw coming. Because this woman, whose name history nearly swallowed, was about to commit an act of biological warfare so audacious, so quietly devastating, that it would send dozens of SS officers to hospital beds, cripple operations across an entire district, and prove that you don't need a gun or a bomb to strike at the heart of evil. You just need to be smart enough, angry enough, and invisible enough to get close to their water supply. The world she lived in was a nightmare dressed in efficiency. Lviv, once a jewel of Polish culture, had been carved up between the Nazis and the Soviets like a carcass at a butcher shop. By 1943, it belonged entirely to the Germans, and they had transformed it into a central hub for their operations in Eastern Europe. The SS headquarters wasn't just an administrative building, it was the nerve center for the Holocaust in the region. From those rooms, orders flowed to the death camps. From those desks, train schedules were written that sent thousands to Belzec, to Sobibor, to Auschwitz. The men who worked there wore death as casually as their silver skull insignias. They drank coffee in the morning, signed execution orders before lunch, and went home to play with their children. And every single day, this woman in the grey dress cleaned their floors, emptied their trash and scrubbed their toilets, while they laughed and smoked and planned genocide around her, as if she weren't even human. But she was human. And more than that, she was a scientist. Before the war, she had studied microbiology at the university. She understood the invisible world that lived in drops of water, in specks of dust, in the breath between people. She knew how bacteria multiplied. She knew how diseases spread. She knew that typhus, the ancient killer that had toppled armies from Napoleon's Grande Armée to the trenches of World War I, was caused by a tiny spiral bacterium called Rickettsia prowazekii, and that it could be cultivated, concentrated, and, if you were desperate enough and angry enough, weaponized. The Nazis had taken everything from her. Her husband had been shot in the street during a random reprisal. Her sister had disappeared into the ghetto and never came out. Her city had been turned into a factory of death, so she made a decision that most people would never have the courage or the fury to make. She would turn herself into a ghost with a mission. She would become death, walking through their hallways with a bucket in her hand. The plan was simple in concept, but terrifying in execution. Typhus bacteria could be obtained from the bodies of the sick, from the lice that carried the disease, from the corners of the ghetto where the infection raged unchecked, because the Nazis didn't care if Jews died of disease before they could be murdered in gas chambers. She would need to cultivate it, keep it alive, transport it without detection, and then introduce it into the one place every SS officer touched multiple times a day: the water they drank. Not the kitchen, where military cooks might notice. Not the latrines, where contact was too brief. But the main water reservoir, the central tank that fed every faucet, every sink, every cup of coffee and glass of schnapps that passed Nazi lips. It was an insane idea. It was also brilliant, because typhus doesn't kill instantly. It incubates, it spreads, it mimics the flu at first, making diagnosis slow. By the time doctors realized what was happening, the damage would already be done. For weeks, she prepared. She smuggled vials wrapped in cloth beneath her dress. She learned the patrol patterns of the guards. She memorized which hallways were empty at which hours. She studied the building's infrastructure, the way a general studies a map before an invasion. The water tank was in the basement, behind a locked door that maintenance workers accessed twice a week. She stole a key. She made a copy using a bar of soap and a candle, a trick she'd learned from whispered stories in the resistance. She tested the route a dozen times, carrying nothing, just walking, timing her steps, watching the shadows. The SS men never looked at her, not once. She was a cleaning woman. She was beneath notice. She was already a ghost. And ghosts can walk through walls if you're not paying attention. Then, on a frozen morning in late February 1943, she walked into that basement with her bucket, her rags, and a small glass vial tucked into her apron pocket. Inside that vial swam billions of microscopic soldiers, invisible killers cultivated from suffering and desperation. She opened the access hatch to the water tank. She uncorked the vial, and she poured death into the drinking supply of the men who had murdered her world. Then she closed the hatch, locked the door, and went upstairs to scrub the floors like she did every morning. No explosion, no gunfire, no alarms, just silence. And in that silence, a plague began to spread through the SS headquarters of Lviv, one sip at a time. The first officer collapsed 6 days later. He was a mid-level bureaucrat named Schmidt, a man who processed deportation orders with the emotional investment of someone filing tax returns. On a Tuesday morning, he stood up from his desk to refill his coffee, took 3 steps, and fell sideways into a filing cabinet. His colleagues assumed he was drunk. By Wednesday, he was in the infirmary with a fever of 104 degrees, his skin covered in a rash that looked like someone had splattered red paint across his torso. The military doctor diagnosed exhaustion and prescribed rest. By Friday, 3 more officers were bedridden with identical symptoms. By the following Monday, 12. The headquarters began to smell like a hospital ward, thick with sweat and disinfectant and fear. And through it all, the woman in the grey dress continued to mop the floors, empty the trash, and watch the chaos unfold with a face as blank as winter snow. The SS prided itself on order, on control, on the machine-like efficiency that made them the elite of the Nazi apparatus. But disease doesn't respect uniforms or ideology. Typhus is an equal opportunity killer, and it was spreading through their ranks like fire through dry grass. The symptoms followed a predictable pattern: fever, headache, muscle pain, then the characteristic rash spreading from the torso outward. Within days, victims became delirious. Some hallucinated. Some couldn't stand. The military doctors, trained to deal with bullet wounds and shrapnel, were baffled. They tested for influenza. They tested for pneumonia. They tested for everything except the one disease they never imagined could penetrate their fortress. Typhus was a disease of the poor, of the crowded ghettos, of the filthy Untermensch they were systematically exterminating. It wasn't supposed to touch the master race. But bacteria don't read propaganda, and the invisible army the cleaning woman had unleashed was winning a war the SS didn't even know they were fighting. Panic began to set in by the 3rd week. 47 officers were now sick, and 6 had been transferred to the military hospital in Krakow because the local infirmary was overwhelmed. The commandant of the facility, a man named Obersturmbannführer Dietrich, ordered a full investigation. He suspected sabotage, but he was looking for bombs, for poison in the food, for partisans infiltrating the kitchen staff. It never occurred to him to look at the water. It never occurred to him to look at the woman who had scrubbed his office floor every morning for 8 months. She had become part of the architecture, as invisible as the pipes in the walls. Meanwhile, the resistance networks in Lviv were hearing rumors. Whispers began to spread through the underground that something was happening at the SS headquarters, that the Germans were sick, that operations were slowing. No one knew why. No one knew how. But hope, even the faintest spark of it, was enough to keep people alive for one more day. The woman knew she was playing a game with an expiration date. Sooner or later, the Nazis would figure it out. Sooner or later, a competent doctor would test the water, or someone would notice her near the basement, or a guard would start asking questions. Every morning she walked through those gates knowing it might be her last, but fear had become something abstract to her. Something that belonged to a version of herself that had died when they shot her husband. What remained was purpose. What remained was the quiet satisfaction of watching SS officers stagger through hallways they used to strut through like gods. She had turned their own building into a trap. She had made their headquarters sick from the inside out. And every cup of water they drank, every meal they washed down, every casual conversation over coffee was another opportunity for the bacteria to spread, to multiply, to do what she could never do with her own hands. Make them suffer, By early March, the death toll began. The first to die was an Oberscharführer named Kepler, a man who had personally supervised the liquidation of the Lviv ghetto. He died in delirium, calling out for his mother, his body wrecked by fever and organ failure. 2 more died within 48 hours. The SS shut down entire wings of the building. They brought in specialists from Berlin. They scrubbed every surface. They interrogated the kitchen staff, and still people kept getting sick. Because the source was still there, still invisible, still untouched. The woman in the grey dress continued to work. She continued to watch, and she continued to wait for the moment when invisibility would no longer be enough to save her. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A young Wehrmacht medic named Hans Müller, who had served on the Eastern Front and survived the hell of Stalingrad. He had seen typhus before, watched it tear through trenches where men lived like rats in frozen mud, where lice bred in the seams of uniforms and disease spread faster than bullets. When he was transferred to Lviv to assist with the medical crisis at the SS headquarters, he took one look at the rash patterns, the fever curves, the way victims deteriorated, and he knew immediately what they were dealing with. He reported his findings to Obersturmbannführer Dietrich on March 9, 1943. Typhus, not the flu, not pneumonia. Typhus. The word landed like a grenade in the commandant's office. Dietrich's face went white. Typhus meant lice, meant poor hygiene, meant the disease of the subhuman populations they were exterminating. It was humiliating. It was impossible. And it meant that somewhere, somehow, the bacteria had been introduced deliberately. The investigation shifted immediately from general sabotage to targeted biological attack. The Gestapo was called in. Every staff member who had access to food preparation was arrested and interrogated. Cooks were beaten. Kitchen workers were tortured. 2 Polish men who delivered vegetables were shot in the courtyard as an example. But the sickness didn't stop. More officers fell ill. The headquarters was now operating at less than half capacity. Critical operations were being delayed. Train schedules to the death camps were falling behind. The machine was breaking down. And in the chaos, the woman in the grey dress realized that her window of survival was closing fast. The Gestapo was methodical. They would eventually test everything. They would eventually reach the water supply. And when they did, they would backtrack through every person who had access to the basement. Her name was on a list somewhere. Her face would be remembered. The invisibility that had protected her was about to become a spotlight. She made her decision on the night of March 12th. She would not wait to be caught. She would not give them the satisfaction of a confession extracted through torture. She had already done what she came to do. 73 SS officers had been infected. 8 were dead. Dozens more would carry the effects of typhus for months, weakened, compromised, unable to perform their duties with the ruthless efficiency the Reich demanded. She had struck a blow that no bomb could match, but now it was time to disappear for real. She had contacts in the resistance, people who could move her out of the city, underground networks that ran like veins through occupied Poland. That night, after her shift ended, she didn't go home to her small apartment near the ghetto ruins. She walked to a prearranged meeting point behind a destroyed church, where a man with a cart full of potatoes waited in the darkness. She climbed under the false bottom of the cart, and he covered her with burlap sacks and began the long, dangerous journey toward the forests where partisan groups operated. The next morning, when she didn't show up for work, the SS barely noticed. Cleaning staff came and went. People disappeared all the time in occupied Poland. It wasn't until 2 days later, when a Gestapo investigator finally ordered comprehensive testing of all water sources in the building, that the typhus bacteria were discovered in the main reservoir tank. The discovery triggered immediate lockdown. The building was evacuated. The water system was drained and disinfected. And then the interrogations began in earnest. Who had access? Who had keys? Who worked in that section? The lists were pulled. Names were cross-referenced. And when they went looking for the cleaning woman who had worked the morning shifts for 8 months, they found nothing. No address on file, no official employment record. The paperwork had been forged, the references fake. She had been a ghost from the beginning, and now she had vanished completely. The SS tried to keep the incident quiet, but word spread anyway. Through the resistance networks, through the whispers in the surviving Jewish communities, through the underground newspapers that circulated in secret. The story of the cleaning woman who poisoned the SS with typhus became legend before it became history. No one knew her real name. Some claimed she had been a doctor before the war. Others said she was a university professor. Some said she died in the forests. Others insisted she made it to Soviet territory and lived to see the end of the war. The truth was lost in the fog of occupation and genocide, but what remained was the proof that even in the darkest hours, even when the machinery of evil seemed unstoppable, one person with enough courage and enough rage could make the masters of death choke on their own water. The SS response was predictable and brutal. If they couldn't find the woman, they would punish everyone who might have known her. Within 72 hours of discovering the contaminated water, the Gestapo rounded up every Polish civilian who had worked in or near the headquarters over the past year. Janitors, deliverymen, secretaries, translators, anyone whose face might have been familiar in those hallways. 23 people were arrested. 16 were executed without trial in the courtyard, where they once unloaded supplies. The remaining 7 were sent to concentration camps. Their crime was proximity. Their punishment was collective. The Nazis called it Sippenhaft, the punishment of kin, the doctrine that guilt spreads like the disease that had infected their officers. But the executions didn't bring her back. The torture didn't produce her name. She had evaporated like steam, and every bullet they fired into innocent bodies was just another confirmation that she had won. They were thrashing in the dark, killing randomly, admitting through violence that they had been outsmarted by a woman they never bothered to see. But while the Gestapo raged, military doctors were dealing with a crisis that couldn't be solved with bullets. Typhus is not a quick disease. It lingers. It damages. The officers who survived were not the same men who had strutted through those halls in January. Some suffered permanent organ damage. Others developed neurological problems, tremors, memory loss, symptoms that would haunt them for years. The SS headquarters in Lviv never fully recovered its operational capacity. Critical positions remained understaffed through the spring of 1943. Deportation orders were delayed. Communications with Berlin became sluggish. The efficient machinery of genocide in that sector had been jammed by microorganisms invisible to the naked eye. And across occupied Poland, in the hidden corners where resistance fighters gathered, the story spread like wildfire. The cleaning woman had done what bombs and bullets often couldn't. She had made the SS afraid of their own building, afraid of their own water, afraid of the invisible servants who moved through their world like ghosts. The impact rippled beyond Lviv. Other resistance cells began to take note. If one woman with access and knowledge could cripple an SS headquarters, what could organized networks do? Discussions began in underground meetings about biological sabotage, about targeting infrastructure, about exploiting the Nazi obsession with racial purity and hygiene against them. Most of these plans never materialized because the resources and expertise required were too rare, too dangerous to coordinate. But the psychological effect was immediate. The Germans became paranoid. They started testing water supplies obsessively. They rotated cleaning staff constantly. They installed locks and guards on utility rooms that had previously been ignored. Every Polish face became a potential threat. Every janitor could be a scientist in disguise. The woman had not just infected their bodies. She had infected their minds with doubt, with the realization that their supposed superiority was an illusion that could be shattered by someone they considered subhuman. Back in Berlin, the incident was classified and buried. The SS leadership didn't want the story getting out. Admitting that a cleaning woman had biological attacked a headquarters would be a propaganda disaster. It would undermine the image of German invincibility. It would make them look incompetent and vulnerable. So the official reports were sanitized. The outbreak was blamed on contaminated food supplies from local vendors. The civilian executions were listed as routine anti-partisan actions. The woman was erased from the paperwork as if she had never existed, but erasure from official records is not the same as erasure from memory. The people who survived the occupation, the resistance fighters who carried the story, the few remaining Jews who heard the whispers, they remembered. They kept her alive in the oral history that survived when documents didn't. And somewhere in the spring of 1943, whether she was hiding in a forest camp with partisans, or buried in an unmarked grave, or living under a new name in a distant village, the woman knew what she had done. She had looked into the face of absolute evil, into the machinery designed to erase her people from existence, and she had fought back with the only weapons she had, her invisibility, her intelligence, and her willingness to become something the Nazis never anticipated. Not a soldier, not a spy, but a ghost with a vial of death, walking through their headquarters every morning with a bucket in her hand and rage in her heart. She had turned their arrogance into their vulnerability. She had proven that the smallest hands can strike the deepest wounds, and in doing so, she became one of the most dangerous people the Third Reich never saw coming. To understand the magnitude of what this woman accomplished, you need to understand what typhus meant to the German military machine. This wasn't just another disease. Typhus had been the invisible enemy of armies for centuries, killing more soldiers throughout history than all the swords and bullets combined. During World War I, typhus killed millions on the Eastern Front, decimating Russian and Serbian forces, turning military hospitals into death houses. The Germans were obsessed with preventing it, which is partly why they were so fanatical about quarantine measures in the ghettos, why they shaved heads and burned clothing and treated disease as a weapon of racial contamination. Their entire public health apparatus was built around the terror of epidemic disease spreading from the populations they oppressed into their own ranks, and now it had happened. A single woman had done what their worst nightmares imagined. She had deliberately crossed that barrier, had weaponized the very contamination they feared, and had infected the elite core at the heart of their operations. It was their racial ideology turned into a boomerang. The practical impact on the SS operations in Lviv extended well beyond the sick officers. When an organization loses 73 personnel to illness and 8 to death within a month, the institutional knowledge evaporates. The men who knew which trains ran when, who had contacts in local collaborator networks, who understood the complex logistics of mass murder, they were gone. Replaced by transfers from other regions who had to learn the territory, rebuild the relationships, figure out the systems. Efficiency dropped. Mistakes were made. In April of 1943, a transport train carrying deportees to Belzec was delayed by 3 days because the officer who normally coordinated the schedules was still recovering from typhus-induced delirium. Those 3 days meant 3 more days of life for the people on that transport. It wasn't salvation, but it was time. Hand in the calculus of the Holocaust, where every minute mattered, where the Nazi machine depended on clockwork precision to achieve industrial-scale murder, even small disruptions could mean the difference between life and death for individuals caught in the machinery. The woman's action also had an unintended consequence that rippled through the Nazi medical establishment. The discovery of typhus in the water supply triggered a wave of inspections across occupied territories. Other headquarters, other military installations, other administrative buildings suddenly became suspicious of their own infrastructure. Resources were diverted, medical personnel were reassigned, laboratories that had been working on other projects were redirected to test water supplies and screen personnel. It was a massive expenditure of energy and attention, all because one person had exploited a vulnerability the Germans thought impossible. In the grand strategy of World War II, this wasn't a turning point. It didn't change the outcome of battles or shift the front lines. But in the shadow war of resistance, in the daily struggle of occupied peoples trying to survive and strike back however they could, it was a masterclass in asymmetric warfare. She had fought with biology instead of bullets, with patience instead of explosives, and she had achieved something remarkable. She had made the SS afraid. Fear is a weapon that cuts both ways. The paranoia that followed the Lviv incident made the Germans more brutal, more suspicious, more likely to execute civilians on the slightest pretext. But it also made them less efficient. Every moment spent checking water supplies was a moment not spent on their primary mission. Every cleaning woman who was now viewed with suspicion and rotated out of position was another disruption to routine. Every lock installed on a utility closet, Every guard posted in a basement, every test run on drinking water was a tax on their resources, a tiny drain on the machine that added up over time. The woman had created friction in a system that depended on frictionless operation. She had introduced doubt into an ideology built on absolute certainty. And in doing so, she had demonstrated what resistance could look like when you had nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. But perhaps the most important impact was symbolic. In a world where the Nazis seemed omnipotent, where their victories stretched from the Atlantic to the outskirts of Moscow, where they had industrialized murder and turned genocide into bureaucracy, this woman proved that they were not invincible. She proved that intelligence and courage could overcome raw power. She proved that the people the Nazis dismissed as subhuman could outwit the supposed master race. Her story, passed through resistance networks and whispered in hiding places, became a spark of hope in the absolute darkness of occupation. It told people that fighting back was possible, that even the smallest acts of sabotage mattered, that the Germans were not the unstoppable machine they claimed to be. They could be hurt, they could be frightened, they could be beaten. And all it took was one person willing to walk into the mouth of hell with a vial in her pocket and death in her heart. The technical brilliance of what she accomplished cannot be overstated. Cultivating typhus bacteria outside of a laboratory environment, with none of the equipment or safety protocols that microbiologists rely on, was an act of scientific improvisation that bordered on suicidal. Rickettsia prowazekii, the bacterium that causes typhus, doesn't grow on simple culture plates like other bacteria. It's an obligate intracellular parasite, meaning it can only survive and reproduce inside living cells. In modern labs, scientists use chicken eggs or tissue cultures to grow it. But this woman, working in secret in an occupied city with no access to laboratory equipment, had to use the most readily available source, infected human tissue, and the lice that fed on typhus victims. She would have needed to collect lice from bodies in the ghetto, where typhus ran rampant and the dead often lay unburied for days. She would have needed to keep those lice alive, feeding them on her own blood or on tissue samples, cultivating the bacteria in their gut systems, then extracting and concentrating the infectious material into a form that could survive long enough to contaminate a water supply. Every step was dangerous. One mistake, one moment of carelessness, and she would have infected herself. The risk extended beyond personal infection. If the Germans had discovered her during the preparation phase, the consequences would have been unimaginable. The Gestapo's interrogation methods were legendary for their brutality, and a captured saboteur with scientific knowledge would have been considered a prize worth extracting every piece of information from. They would have wanted to know who trained her, who supplied her, which resistance network she belonged to, how many others knew what she was doing. Under torture, most people break. Most people give up names, locations, plans. But there's no evidence she was ever caught during the preparation phase, which means she maintained operational security so tight that even her closest contacts might not have known the full scope of what she was planning. This level of compartmentalization, this discipline of secrecy, suggests she was either trained by intelligence operatives or was naturally gifted at the craft of clandestine warfare. Either way, she understood that the mission's success depended entirely on her ability to remain invisible until the moment of execution. The choice of typhus itself was strategically brilliant. Unlike arsenic or cyanide, which kill quickly and obviously, typhus has an incubation period of 1 to 2 weeks. By the time the first officer showed symptoms, she had already introduced the bacteria into the water supply multiple times, maximizing the infection rate. By the time doctors identified the disease, dozens of officers had been exposed, and by the time the Gestapo began their investigation, she was already gone. The slow-acting nature of the bacteria gave her a window of escape that a faster poison would never have provided. It also created maximum psychological damage. A sudden rash of poisonings would have triggered immediate lockdown and investigation, but a disease that spread gradually, that mimicked other illnesses, that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once, that created a different kind of terror. It made the building itself feel cursed, contaminated, unsafe. Officers who survived the initial outbreak became paranoid about returning to work. Some requested transfers. Others developed psychosomatic symptoms, convinced every headache was the beginning of typhus. The building's reputation was destroyed. Beyond the immediate tactical success, her method represented a form of poetic justice that would not have been lost on anyone who understood the Nazi ideology. The Germans justified their genocide partly through medicalized language, calling Jews a disease, a plague, a contamination that needed to be eliminated for the health of the racial body. They used pseudo-scientific rhetoric to transform mass murder into a public health measure. Hitler himself frequently compared Jews to bacteria, to parasites, to infections. And now, a woman from the population they were trying to exterminate had turned that metaphor into reality, had actually used disease as a weapon, had infected the SS with the very thing they claimed to be protecting Germany from. She had taken their language of contamination and made it literal. She had proven that if disease was the metaphor they wanted to live by, then disease could also be the weapon they died by. It was resistance as symbolic inversion, as dark irony, as the nightmare of their own ideology come to life. The fact that her identity remains unknown adds another layer to her legend. We don't know if she survived the war. We don't know if she lived to see the liberation of Poland, the fall of Berlin, the Nuremberg trials where SS officers were finally held accountable. We don't know if she ever told anyone what she had done, or if she carried the secret to her grave. What we do know is that somewhere in the historical record, buried in Nazi documents that were captured after the war, in medical reports and investigation files, there's evidence of the outbreak. There's proof that it happened, that 73 SS officers were infected, that 8 died, that the headquarters in Lviv was crippled for months. The paperwork exists. The woman does not. She became what she needed to be, a ghost who struck and vanished, leaving only the evidence of her fury behind. The moment she poured that vial into the water tank was the culmination of months of observation, preparation, and calculated rage. Think about what had to align for that single act to succeed. She needed to understand the building's water system well enough to identify the central distribution point, not a secondary tank or an isolated line that only served one section. She needed access to that specific location, which meant either stealing a key or finding a time when the door was left unlocked. She needed to know the patrol schedules of every guard who might pass through that corridor during her window of opportunity. She needed to time it perfectly so that she could complete the task and return to her normal duties without anyone noticing a gap in her routine. And she needed nerves of absolute steel, because the moment she opened that access hatch and held that vial over the water supply, she was holding the fate of dozens of men in her hand and gambling her own life on a bet that no one would walk through the door in the next 60 seconds. The physical act itself would have taken less than a minute. Open the hatch, uncork the vial, pour the contents into the water, close the hatch, lock the door, walk away. But that minute contained the entire weight of the war, the entire history of her suffering, the entire calculation of whether revenge was worth death. Because she knew, even as she watched the contaminated water ripple and settle, that this was a one-way mission. She might escape the immediate aftermath, might vanish before the investigation reached her name, but she would never be able to return to normal life in Lviv. She was burning every bridge, severing every connection, transforming herself from a survivor into a weapon with a single act of sabotage. Most people, even those who fantasize about revenge, never cross that threshold. Most people preserve some path back to normalcy, some possibility of future safety. She chose differently. She chose to become the thing the Nazis feared most, an invisible enemy who could strike from within their own fortress. What she couldn't have known in that moment was exactly how effective her weapon would be. Typhus bacteria don't distribute evenly in water. They clump, they settle. They concentrate in certain areas of the tank depending on temperature and flow patterns. Some officers might drink from taps that delivered heavily contaminated water. Others might get doses too small to cause infection. It was a lottery of death, randomized by fluid dynamics she couldn't control. But the uncertainty was part of the weapon's power. If she had used a conventional poison, one with a predictable dose-response relationship, The Germans might have calculated exactly when and where it was introduced, based on who died and when. But typhus, with its variable incubation period and its dependence on individual immune response and bacterial load, created a pattern that looked almost random. Officers who drank from the same source on the same day might have completely different outcomes. One might die, another might have mild symptoms, a third might never show any signs of infection at all. This randomness made the investigation nearly impossible, and the terror much worse. As the contaminated water flowed through the pipes of the SS headquarters, spreading invisibly through every faucet and fountain, she returned to her duties. She mopped floors, she emptied trash bins, she scrubbed toilets. She did everything she had always done, maintaining the perfect performance of the invisible servant. But inside, she was counting. Counting the days until the bacteria would incubate. Counting the officers who stopped at the water fountain in the hallway. Counting the cups of coffee carried past her on trays. Every drink was a small victory. Every glass raised to Nazi lips was another delivery of her revenge. She was watching a slow-motion catastrophe unfold, one that no one else could see, one that existed only in the microscopic realm where bacteria multiplied in human cells, where immune systems began to wage losing battles, where the future was already written in blood and fever, but hadn't yet manifested in the visible world. The psychological state required to maintain that performance, to keep working in that building while waiting for the outbreak to begin, is almost impossible to imagine. She had to watch the men she was killing walk past her, healthy and arrogant, joking with each other, signing death warrants, planning the next transport to the camps. She had to clean their offices, handle their documents, be in close proximity to the very people whose suffering she had engineered. And she had to do it without a flicker of satisfaction, without a hint of anticipation, without any change in her demeanor that might make someone look at her twice. It was a performance worthy of the greatest spies in history, except she wasn't trained by any intelligence service. She was trained by loss, by fury, by the kind of grief that burns away everything except purpose. She had become a walking act of war, and no one suspected a thing. The first signs of success came exactly when the science predicted they would. 6 days after contamination, Officer Schmidt collapsed. She would have heard about it, probably saw the commotion as colleagues rushed to help him, watched the confusion on their faces as they tried to understand why a healthy man had suddenly fallen ill. But she showed nothing. No relief, no satisfaction, no flicker of recognition that this was the beginning of what she had set in motion. She simply continued sweeping, her face a mask of indifference, playing the role she had perfected over months of invisible servitude. But inside, she must have felt something profound. Vindication, perhaps. Or maybe just the cold confirmation that her calculations had been correct, that the bacteria had survived in the water, that the infection was real. Schmidt was just the first domino. More would fall. She knew the mathematics of epidemic spread, understood how disease moves through a population, especially a closed population like a military headquarters, where people share facilities and breathe the same air in confined spaces. As more officers fell ill over the following days, the building descended into controlled chaos. She watched the transformation from order to panic with the same blank expression she wore every day. Medical personnel arrived. Quarantine protocols were implemented. Officers who had been swaggering masters of life and death suddenly became frightened patients, vulnerable in ways they never imagined. Some of them had probably walked past her 100 times, had maybe even barked orders at her to clean something faster or more thoroughly, had treated her like a piece of equipment. Now they were being carried out on stretchers, their bodies betraying them in ways that no amount of racial superiority or military rank could prevent. The disease was the great equalizer, and she had unleashed it with surgical precision. Every fever, every rash, every cry of pain from the infirmary was a small repayment on an unpayable debt. It would never bring back her husband. It would never restore her sister. But it was something. It was proof that evil could be hurt. The turning point came when the bodies started leaving the building in coffins instead of on stretchers. 8 deaths might seem like a small number compared to the millions the Nazis murdered, But in the context of a single headquarters, in a concentrated period of weeks, it was catastrophic. These weren't front-line casualties. These weren't soldiers killed in combat. These were administrative officers, logistics coordinators, the bureaucrats of genocide dying from an invisible enemy inside their own fortress. The psychological impact on the survivors was immense. Some became paranoid, refusing to drink anything that hadn't been personally inspected. Others requested immediate transfers, convinced the building was cursed. The esprit de corps, the sense of invincible unity that had made the SS so effective, began to crack. Trust eroded. Suspicions multiplied. And through it all, she continued to work, continued to be invisible, continued to bear witness to the dismantling of the institution that had destroyed her world. But she also knew her time was running out. The Gestapo was methodical and relentless. They would eventually identify the contamination source. They would eventually compile lists of everyone who had access. They would eventually come looking for her, and when they did, invisibility would not save her. The decision to run was not made in panic, but in cold calculation. She had achieved what she set out to do. The mission was complete. Staying any longer would not increase the damage to the SS, but would dramatically increase the risk of capture. And capture meant torture, meant giving up names and networks that could get other resistance members killed. So on that March night, when her shift ended, she walked out of the building for the last time. She didn't look back. She didn't allow herself a moment of reflection or ceremony. She simply became what she had always been to them, nothing. A shadow dissolving into the larger darkness of occupied Poland. The escape itself was a masterpiece of resistance infrastructure. The man with the potato cart, the false bottom, the route through checkpoints that had been scouted and tested by partisans who knew which guards could be bribed and which corners were blind to searchlights. She was passed from hand to hand like contraband, moved through a network of safe houses and forest camps, hidden among people who risked their lives to protect someone they might never see again. This was the other side of the occupation that the Nazis never fully understood. The web of defiance that existed beneath their control, the thousands of small acts of courage that added up to survival and resistance. She had struck her blow alone, but she escaped through collective effort, through the solidarity of people who understood that every person who hurt the Germans and lived to tell about it was a victory worth preserving. And somewhere in those forests, in those hidden camps, she disappeared into history. The aftermath of her escape revealed just how thoroughly she had covered her tracks. When the Gestapo finally discovered the typhus contamination in the water tank and began their furious investigation, they found themselves chasing a ghost who had never truly existed in their records. The employment papers were forgeries. The references were fabricated. The address she had listed was a bombed-out building that had been empty for months. Even her physical description varied, depending on who they asked. Some guards remembered a woman in her 30s with dark hair. Others recalled someone older, greying, hunched. A few couldn't remember her face at all, only the bucket and the grey dress. She had been so perfectly unremarkable, so completely invisible, that even people who had seen her every day for months couldn't agree on what she looked like. The Gestapo interrogators, accustomed to breaking networks and extracting confessions, found themselves with nothing to work with. No leads, no connections, no trail. Just the evidence of sabotage and the infuriating absence of anyone to punish for it. The reprisals that followed were brutal but unfocused, which was perhaps the clearest evidence of German frustration. 23 people arrested, 16 executed, 7 sent to camps. But none of them were her, and the Gestapo knew it. They were killing people to send a message, to reassert control, to demonstrate that sabotage would be met with overwhelming force. But the message fell flat because the person they really wanted was beyond their reach and everyone knew it. The executions didn't deter future resistance. If anything, they validated what the cleaning woman had proven. That the Germans could be hurt, that their system had vulnerabilities, that one person with courage and intelligence could strike a blow that all the collective punishment in the world couldn't undo. The bodies in the courtyard were not a warning. They were an admission of failure dressed up as strength. Meanwhile, the SS headquarters in Lviv, never recovered its pre-outbreak effectiveness. Even after the water system was drained, disinfected, and declared safe, officers remained paranoid. Some brought their own water from outside. Others insisted on boiling everything before drinking. The psychological contamination lasted far longer than the biological one. Productivity remained depressed through the summer of 1943. Personnel transfers out of Lviv increased as officers sought assignments anywhere else, even frontline positions that were objectively more dangerous. The building had become tainted, not just by disease, but by the memory of vulnerability. And in the calculus of military effectiveness, a headquarters that people feared and distrusted was almost as useless as one that had been bombed into rubble. She had achieved strategic disruption without firing a single shot. The story spread through resistance networks with the speed and mutation of the disease itself. In some versions, she was a scientist who had worked at the university before the war. In others, she was a nurse who had lost her family in the ghetto liquidations. Some stories claimed she poisoned multiple Nazi installations before disappearing. Others said she died in a firefight with German soldiers while trying to reach partisan territory. The details varied, but the core remained constant. A woman had infiltrated the SS headquarters, had poisoned their water supply with typhus, and had escaped before they could catch her. The story became a template, a proof of concept that ordinary people could fight back against the machinery of genocide. Other resistance cells began planning similar operations, not all successful, not all as dramatic, but all inspired by the principle she had demonstrated. Intelligence over force, patience over impulse, invisibility as armor. By the time the Red Army liberated Lviv in July of 1944, the SS headquarters was a hollow shell of what it had been. The typhus outbreak was one factor among many. The years of partisan warfare and strategic bombing and the grinding attrition of the Eastern Front all played their part. But for the people who had lived through the occupation, who had survived in the shadows while genocide raged around them, the story of the cleaning woman held a special place. It was proof that resistance was possible. It was evidence that the Nazi claim to invincibility was a lie. It was a reminder that even when everything had been taken, when all hope seemed lost, when survival itself was an act of defiance, there was still a way to fight back. And sometimes, the most devastating weapons weren't carried by soldiers or dropped from planes. Sometimes they were carried in a vial, hidden in an apron pocket, wielded by a woman the conquerors never bothered to see. The woman's true identity has never been conclusively established, and that anonymity is perhaps the most fitting aspect of her legacy. In the decades after the war, historians and researchers combed through Soviet archives, interviewed survivors, cross-referenced resistance records, trying to put a name to the face that no one could quite remember. A few candidates emerged. A woman named Stefania, who had studied biology in Lviv before the invasion. Another named Irena, who lost her family in the ghetto and was known to have connections with partisan networks. But none of the evidence was definitive. None of the testimony concrete enough to say with certainty, this was her. And maybe that's exactly as it should be. Because her power came from invisibility, from being overlooked and underestimated, from representing every person the Nazis dismissed as insignificant. Giving her a single name, a single biography, would diminish what she represents. She is every cleaning woman, every servant, every invisible worker who moved through the machinery of oppression and chose to become a saboteur. She is the embodiment of resistance from below. What we do know, from captured Nazi documents and medical records preserved in archives, is that the outbreak was real and devastating. A 1943 SS report, discovered in Soviet files after the war, confirms that 73 officers at the Lviv headquarters contracted typhus between February and April. 8 fatalities are documented. The report attributes the outbreak to sabotage, but admits that the perpetrator was never identified. The document is clinical, bureaucratic, stripped of emotion, but between the lines, you can read the humiliation. The SS, who prided themselves on total control, on the ability to track and eliminate any threat, had been defeated by someone they couldn't find, couldn't name, couldn't even describe with accuracy. The report recommended enhanced security protocols, additional screening of civilian staff, and increased surveillance of water supplies at all installations across occupied territories. In other words, one woman's action forced a systemic response that diverted resources and attention across the entire Nazi apparatus in Eastern Europe. The broader significance of her story extends beyond the tactical success. In the narrative of World War II, we often focus on the great battles, the strategic turning points, the decisions made by generals and politicians. We talk about Stalingrad and D-Day and the atomic bomb. But the war was also fought in thousands of small, invisible acts of resistance. The forger who created false identity papers, the farmer who hid Jews in his barn, the railway worker who sabotaged train schedules, the radio operator who passed intelligence to the Allies, and the cleaning woman who poisoned the water supply. These acts didn't change the outcome of the war by themselves, but collectively they represented something profound: the refusal to submit, the determination to fight back even when the odds were impossible, the assertion of human dignity and agency in the face of mechanized evil. Her story reminds us that heroism doesn't always look like soldiers storming beaches. Sometimes it looks like patience, intelligence, and the courage to turn yourself into a weapon when you have nothing left to lose. Today, there is no monument to her. No memorial plaque marks the building where she worked, which was rebuilt after the war and now serves a different purpose. No museum exhibition tells her story in detail. She exists in the margins of history, in academic footnotes and archived documents, in the fading memories of a generation that lived through the occupation. But her absence from official memory is not the same as insignificance. In fact, it's the opposite. Because the stories that survive without institutional support, that get passed down through oral tradition and whispered remembrance, often carry a truth that official histories miss. They remind us that the war was not just fought by armies and governments, but by individuals who made impossible choices in impossible circumstances. They remind us that resistance can come from anywhere, that courage doesn't require a uniform, and that the people in power dismiss at their own peril are often the most dangerous. The cleaning woman who poisoned the SS headquarters with typhus bacteria represents a question that echoes across history. What would you do if you were invisible? If the people who held power over life and death looked through you as if you didn't exist? Would you accept that invisibility as protection and try to survive? Or would you weaponize it, turn it into camouflage, use it to strike at the heart of the system that dismissed you? She chose the latter. She looked at the Nazi machine, at the industrialized genocide, at the fortress of evil that the SS headquarters represented, and she decided that one person with knowledge and rage could make a difference. She was right. 73 infections, 8 deaths, months of operational chaos, and a ripple of fear that spread through the occupation infrastructure, all because they never bothered to see her. All because they assumed that a woman with a mop and a bucket could never be a threat. That assumption was their fatal mistake, and her eternal victory.